The wind howled like a starving coyote across the plains, battering the corners of the small, weather-worn cabin. Rain came in bursts, like handfuls of stones thrown against the roof, and thunder cracked so loud it seemed the world might split open. Inside, Clara Belle sat cross-legged by the hearth, darning a tear in her only good dress by the orange light of the fire. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, but her fingers moved with practiced ease. She was alone, had been for over a year now, ever since her father died from a rattler bite out near the spring. Suddenly, her dog growled low and deep in his throat. His ears perked toward the door, body tense like a bowstring. Clara froze. Her needle paused in midair. That kind of growl didn't mean coyotes. Then came the knock, not polite, heavy, desperate. A single thud, like a body leaning against the wood more than a true request to enter. She stood slowly, heart hammering. Her father's old shotgun leaned in the corner, but something, curiosity, perhaps even compassion, moved her to reach for the lantern instead. She approached the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice louder than she expected. No answer, just the sound of the wind and another faint groan. Clara unlatched the door. There, nearly collapsed against the frame, stood a young man, a Comanche, unmistakably. His dark hair was plastered to his face, and his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. One arm cradled the other, clearly injured. His face was bruised, blood trailing down from his temple, and his bare feet were caked in mud and something darker. He looked up at her, barely able to focus. She stepped back. "Jesus," she whispered, gripping the door. He didn't speak, couldn't. His eyes fluttered, and his knees buckled. Clara moved instinctively, catching him beneath the arms before he fell. He was burning with fever and heavier than he looked. Against everything she'd been taught, against everything she knew would happen if the settlers found out, she dragged him inside. The door slammed shut behind her as the wind howled again. She laid him near the fire, stripped the wet blanket off his shoulders, and fetched the tin basin. As she cleaned his wounds, she caught fragments of words in a language she didn't understand, uttered through clenched teeth. But once, clear and low, he said something she recognized. "Sacho." She repeated it softly, uncertain. His name. He blinked, once, and gave a small nod before closing his eyes again. Clara worked through the night, boiling water, grinding herbs, wrapping broken skin. She'd learned from her mother, who had known how to bind wounds long before they came to Texas. She didn't know if it would be enough, but she did what she could. By the time the storm began to fade, he was asleep, chest rising steadier now. She sat beside him, arms folded, watching the fire flicker in his dark hair. Outside, the first hints of dawn began to pale the sky. And Clara knew, somehow, that this would not go unnoticed. The first light of morning crept across the wide plains, painting the horizon in dusty gold. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, now more embers than flame. Clara stood at the stove, stirring a pot of cornmeal porridge with one hand, while the other held a tin cup of coffee she hadn't taken a sip from. Her eyes kept flicking to the man lying on the cot by the wall. Sacho slept soundly, though his brow was still furrowed, his body stiff with healing pain. She'd managed to dress most of the wounds, cleaned out the worst of the dirt, and wrapped the gash on his ribs. He hadn't spoken again, but his breathing had evened out during the night. The cabin was quiet except for the faint hiss of the fire, the bubbling of the porridge, and the occasional distant rumble of a storm moving off toward the hills. Then came the sound of hoofs. Several of them, hard and fast over the dirt. Clara stiffened. She moved to the window, peering past the thin curtain. 6 men rode up, dust trailing behind them like a cloak. All wore wide-brimmed hats. Most carried rifles. She recognized them immediately. Men from the settlement. Among them was Sheriff Lyle, tall and lean with a bristly gray mustache, and Deacon Phelps, who never came anywhere without his leather Bible and a bitter sneer. They didn't knock. Sheriff Lyle dismounted and came straight to the door. Clara stepped between the cot and the entry, heart pounding. The knock was hard, 3 times. Then the voice. "Clara Belle, it's the sheriff." She opened the door partway, enough to show her face but not enough for them to see inside. Behind her, she heard Sacho stir faintly on the cot. "Mornin', Sheriff." Lyle glanced past her, trying to peer inside. "We tracked blood all the way from the river. Found horse tracks and a cut rope. One of the patrols said they saw you come back through the dark last night." Clara said nothing. "You got him in there?" the sheriff asked, eyes narrowing. "The Comanche." Behind him, one of the other men spit into the dirt. "I found him half dead outside the barn," she said. "Didn't seem armed. Looked more like someone left him to die." Deacon Phelps snorted. "Doesn't matter if he had a knife or a stick of butter. He's Comanche. That's enough." Clara's jaw tightened. "And what if he were just a man?" "He ain't," Phelps said. "He's a raider. You know what they've done. You think if he walked in here healthy, he'd be asking for porridge?" Sheriff Lyle raised a hand. "Now, Clara, you're not in trouble. Not yet, but you gave him shelter. That much is clear, and whether you knew it or not, well, it puts you in a situation." Clara narrowed her eyes. What kind of situation? Lyle looked uncomfortable. You remember what the council voted back in June. About any woman consorting with an Indian. I didn't consort with anybody. Phelps stepped forward. Don't matter. You took him in, fed him, let him sleep under your roof. Same as laying with him. Makes you his woman in the eyes of the settlement. Clara felt something in her chest go cold. She looked past them, out toward the plains. The sky was bright now, blue and white and cruel. I did what was right, she said finally. You did what was stupid, said Phelps. And there's only one way we make this clean. He smiled, a slow, crooked thing that made Clara want to hit him. You'll marry him, Phelps said. Today, and after that, you'll be his problem. Not ours. Lyle didn't argue. He just looked at her, tired, like a man who'd already seen the decision made and wanted to go back to his coffee. Clara glanced over her shoulder at Sacho. His eyes were open now, barely, watching. He didn't speak, didn't protest. When she turned back to the men, her voice was level. Calm. Then I guess I'd best fetch my mother's shawl. The men looked at one another, surprised by how little fight there was in her tone. But none of them spoke. She shut the door on their boots. Behind her, Sacho's eyes followed her, not with fear, but with something else. The sun beat down hard from a cloudless sky, bleaching the earth until it was pale as bone. At the edge of the settlement, where the land flattened into a dusty clearing, someone had erected a rough wooden arch of mesquite branches. Wildflowers, mostly dry and browning, were hastily knotted around it. A cluster of settlers stood in loose circles, watching as if waiting for a hanging rather than a wedding. Clara stood beside Sacho in front of the makeshift altar. She wore her mother's shawl, faded green, and frayed at the edges, pulled over her shoulders like armor. Her boots were caked with mud. Her hair had been plaited hastily and one strand had already come loose, brushing her cheek in the wind. She didn't brush it away. Sacho stood tall and silent beside her. Someone had given him a clean shirt, too big, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and a woven sash tied around his waist. His hair had been brushed, though not tamed, and the bruise along his jaw had turned yellow with healing. He looked out over the settlers without flinching, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. He stood straight and proud, not the wounded man from her floor the night before. Not the savage they whispered about. Just a man, scarred, quiet, and utterly calm. Reverend Miller, a soft-bellied man who looked more like a store clerk than a preacher, stood stiffly in front of them, clutching his Bible as though it might fly out of his hands. His eyes darted between Clara, Sacho, and the crowd. Clara Bell, the Reverend said, voice strained and uncertain, do you take this man, this individual, to be your lawful husband, under the eyes of God in this community? There was a pause. Clara didn't look at the Reverend. She looked at Sacho. His eyes were still on the people gathered before them. Some of them were neighbors. Some had traded with her father. A few had even been kind to her once. Now none met her eyes. She reached out, took Sacho's hand. I do, she said. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. One man laughed. Another muttered something about shame. Clara didn't hear it. Her voice had been steady. The Reverend blinked, surprised. He turned to Sacho. And, do you, take Clara Bell to be your lawful wife? Sacho turned to her now, slowly. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice low and clear, still thick with the rhythm of another tongue, he said, I do. It was the only English he'd spoken since waking. Somewhere near the back of the crowd, a woman murmured a prayer. One of the settlers, young Joe Whaley, who'd once tried to court Clara when she was 16, spat in the dirt and turned away. Well, then, the Reverend muttered, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you man and wife. May the Lord have mercy. The settlers gave no cheers. No clapping. Just the sounds of boots shifting on dry ground and the crackle of the wind through mesquite trees. Deacon Phelps leaned over to Sheriff Lyle as the small crowd began to scatter. Thought this'd shame her, he said, biting off a piece of jerky. She didn't even blink. Lyle watched Clara and Sacho, who stood still as stones before the altar. She's not shamed, the sheriff said. She's decided. Phelps narrowed his eyes. Watch her. She's got a plan. The two newlyweds hadn't moved yet. Clara looked at Sacho, their hands still joined. You understand what just happened? She asked under her breath. Sacho gave the faintest nod. His fingers tightened around hers, just once. Then they turned, together, and walked away from the crowd, toward the open land. Not toward her cabin. Not toward the settlement. The moon rose full and heavy over the prairie, casting silver light across the endless plains. Crickets sang in the tall grass, and the wind moved like breath through the cottonwoods. In the distance, a column of smoke curled up into the night sky, a thin, dark ribbon against the stars. The smell of burning timber lingered faintly on the breeze. The cabin was gone. Nothing remained but a blackened skeleton of scorched beams and embers still glowing at the edges. Flames had gutted the little home Clara had lived in since she was a child, the same cabin where she'd nursed her father through fever, where she'd buried her mother's ring under the floorboard, where she'd offered a wounded stranger warmth instead of fear. She hadn't cried when they lit it. She hadn't begged or tried to stop them. She had just watched. Now, miles away from the smoldering ruins, Clara rode beneath the moonlight, seated atop her father's old mare. Sacho rode beside her on a younger horse, borrowed, or stolen, from one of the settlers. The animal was fast and sure-footed, and it hadn't flinched when they fled into the dark, slipping through the eastern edge of the settlement before anyone could follow. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Clara's shawl snapped in the wind, and her braid had come undone, her hair loose and wild. Her cheeks were flushed not from fear but from something deeper, liberation, maybe, or fury. She leaned low in the saddle, keeping pace with Sacho, eyes sharp and unblinking. Ahead, the land opened wide and untouched. Hills rolled like waves frozen in time, and trees stood tall along the dry riverbeds. Somewhere beyond them, across the invisible border the settlers pretended was law, lay the Comanche lands, his home. Sacho pointed with 2 fingers toward the dark rise in the distance where a dim flicker of firelight danced. A camp. His people. Clara nodded. She didn't slow. After some time, they crested a ridge. The horses came to a halt, breathing hard. Below them in a hollow, a small fire crackled at the center of a ring of hides and shelters. Shadows moved between them, children, warriors, mothers. They were too far to make out faces, but Clara could see the life in the scene. Laughter rose faintly on the wind. She looked at Sacho. He wasn't watching the camp, he was watching her. "You still want to go?" he asked. His English was careful, every word shaped slowly, but his voice was clear and steady. Clara looked down at the camp again, then back at the smoke curling behind them. "They gave me to you," she said softly. "But they didn't take anything I didn't choose to give." Sacho nodded, something unspoken in his eyes. "They think they broke you." She smiled faintly. "They don't know a thing about me." They sat there for a moment, 2 silhouettes on horseback, outlined by the moon, caught between past and future. Then, wordlessly, they rode down toward the fire. Toward the people who would not ask her to explain, and the land that did not demand her silence.